Good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on which part of the world you're watching this video from. I am Blackbright. I hail from the UK, east of England, and I just like to share information every now and then. And sometimes I do question myself. What is the point of sharing information if you don't have solutions? And then I thought to myself, well, it's not really my responsibility to find the solutions. But what I'm hoping by sharing information is that I'm kind of helping you to protect yourself, to keep yourself safe, and hoping that you will find the solution for yourself, because each person's solution is different from the next person. So I'm going to take that weight off of myself, and I'm not going to chastise myself because I'm not giving you answers, because I cannot provide answers. So I'm just going to share information that I think is useful. Okay, so I've come across the two legislations. I thought it was one legislation to do with the coronavirus, and I was kind of getting them mixed up when I was giving out information. But I found out there's two legislations out because of the coronavirus pandemic. And the first one is the Coronavirus Act, which came out in March, and then they followed it up with a health protection Coronavirus Restrictions England Act in 2020, and both of them are different. I can only simplify it by saying the Coronavirus Act is when there's a massive emergency, and it's going to ultimately be triggered during the second pandemic, I would have thought, where the military comes in. And the Health Protection Act is more to do with social distancing and protecting people with regard to their health. So that is a summary of what I'm going to talk about. So let me think now. Like I said, there is a wealth of information out there. It's up to you what you do with it, and up to you what you do with it after you have determined or confirmed whether the source is credible, incredible, adapted, or simply false. So you can then determine where you want to go with the information. There is so much information. Some of it sounds so credible, some of it depending on who's saying it and how they say it, and some of it is a load of hogwash. And if you examine it and tear it apart and research it, you realise that sometimes they've got these highfalutin people who sound very, very professional, and they are just there to shift your focus and to deceive you. So you have to be really, really careful that you don't get sucked in. If it doesn't make sense, there's probably something not quite right. Okay? So I'm here to talk about the two laws, which we mustn't confuse with each other, which is what I have been doing. The first legislation, you're going to need to put me on pause because this might be a bit long. So if you want to put your feet up, get a cuppa, put me on loudspeaker, whatever it is you do when I do these long videos, go ahead now. Okay? All right then. So the first legislation, Emergency Powers Coronavirus Act, gives the police the power to direct any potentially infected person to go home to a medical facility or testing location. That was changed. Before it said any appropriate place. So that was probably updated. So one thing with these legislations is that they get reviewed every 21 days. So we might be privy to the first legislation, which I think came out on the 21st of April, but then 21st of March, but then on the 21st of April, we know it was amended. And sometimes we have to say, how do we know these amendments are taking place? Well, we'll have to just be governed by the fact that we know that they're reviewed every 21 days. And it's very likely that there's been some amendments snuck in somewhere within those 21 days. Like that guy that found out, well, I don't know if he found out, but there was an amendment on the 21st of April, I believe. And so that kind of was snuck in, but it's not really snuck in once you know they're going to review it every 21 days. So you have to keep checking up to see what amendments are being made. Okay, so the first legislation, I don't know what they mean by potentially infected people. It's very ominous. I don't like that term at all, potentially infected people, because it reminds me once again when they're saying that the disparity between people of colour and Caucasians with regard to the virus, and it is not accurate. But when they say potentially infected people, does that mean they're going to target people of colour? And that is my concern. Or they do have drones, or they will, I don't know how active they are now, but they do have drones that can determine whether or not you have a temperature, can determine your heart rate and all sorts. So is that the way they're going to find out potentially infected people? I just do not like that term, because it's a very, very ominous. But anyway, the police have the power to direct any potentially infected person to go home to a medical facility for testing or a location deemed to be appropriate. Under Schedule 21 of the Coronavirus Act 2020, it is illegal to fail to comply with the instructions of police officers without reasonable excuse, and reasonable excuse is determined by the courts. It's not what you deem reasonable. It's not what the police deem reasonable. It's what the courts deem reasonable. And I'm sure that somewhere within all of those reasonableness, it's going to fall in favour of the courts or the police if you cannot be pacific or obstruct them in the course of their duties. So it is important to know which act or law they're stopping you under. Because if they're stopping you under the Coronavirus Act, if you resist, that's a fine of £1,000. That's the more forceful law. If you're stopped under the Health Protection Act, I'm not going to say the whole thing, it's so long, but I'll just call it health protection for the want of a better word. But the health protection regulations, then that fine is £60 and you pay £30 if you pay it within 2 weeks. That's the main distinction with regard to financial. Okay? How it will impact your pocket, I should say. So when they stop you, just know what they are stopping you under. Regulations are reviewed every 21 days. The Health Protection Coronavirus Business Closure Act, England, was revoked, and new regulations to extend those provisions previously are in force. So they've taken up the business closure part, and it's just called, as far as I know, the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Act 2020, England. So I'll just call it the Health Protection Act for now, okay? And these powers can be used when it has been declared that the virus constitutes a serious and imminent threat to public health, and that using powers would either help to control the transmission of the virus. So that's the first part. Under the Coronavirus Act 2020, offences lead to a fine of up to £1,000 on a summary conviction. Most convictions will expire after 2 years, but could be reviewed, extended or changed by Parliament, but for no longer than 6 months after the 2 years. The Coronavirus Act received the royal assent on the 25th of March, which is why we saw amendments on the 21st of April, because it's reviewed every 21 days. The Coronavirus Act contains emergency powers to enable public bodies, that's usually the military or the government, to respond in specific ways to the coronavirus pandemic. So that's when we're under medical, what do they call it? Medical, I used to know that word, medical coverage anyway. Anyway, it's when they consider us under military rule. The Act gives further powers to the government to slow the spread of the disease. It reduces the resourcing and administrative burden on public bodies, i.e., using the military, and to limit the impact of potential staffing shortages on the delivery of public services, again, by using the military. So mitigating NHS staffing shortages, retirees, medical students at the end of their training, those who have recently left the profession, and retirees can work as long as they want. So what they're doing is, in order to mitigate staffing shortages, they're bringing back retirees, and they're allowing students who haven't quite finished their course to help out, and people who have left the profession to come back. And normally, when you retire from the NHS, you can only do a certain amount of hours. And what they're doing, they're lifting that restriction. So they don't only, I think they're allowed to do, they're not allowed to earn more than what their pension is if they retired. So now that restriction isn't there. So the Act allows delays in the assessment of patients. The Act allows detention and treatment of mental health patients using the opinion of fewer. I think it's only one instead of two or three. Regulations relating to the registration and certification of deaths and stillbirths have been relaxed or eased. So in other words, there's no real monitoring of what is put on the death certificate. That's the way I translate that. Or who actually authorises what's put on there. The Act removes the requirement or the request for any inquest into the deaths. So what I interpret that to mean, you can't go around questioning what they died of. If they've said they've died of coronavirus, you can't go question them for saying, oh, you want an inquest, you want them to do an autopsy and all that kind of stuff. You can't do that. NHS staff are indemnified against criminal or clinical negligence or any liabilities arising out of the activities of NHS staff. The Act allows organisations and facilities to manage capacity problems in the transportation, storage and disposal of dead bodies. So in other words, if they've got a lot of dead bodies, they can just pile them all on a truck, take them somewhere, burn them and get rid of them. In other words, cremate them as they feel fit. One of 15 judicial commissioners, along with the Secretary of State, can sign off warrants under the Investigatory Powers Act. Warrants have been extended to a maximum of 12 days. It used to be 3 days. And approval of a warrant has been extended to 12 days. That means people will be stuck longer in a cell. Fingerprint retention. That's been extended to 6 months. I don't know how long they could retain your fingerprints before. Suspend port operations by Border Force officials. If they want to do that for more than 12 hours, they need the approval of ministers. And the government has passed secondary legislation to give public officials in England emergency powers to test, isolate and detain a person where they have reasonable grounds to think that the person is infected. They just have to think a person is infected, you know. They don't have to have any proof. Can you imagine how subjective that is? They just have to think a person is infected. So that person over there, he's black. He might have the virus. That person over there, he's East Asian. They're susceptible to the virus. We better test him or her. Because that is how it can be deduced when push comes to shove. And then if you breach that, or if you try and resist, it's £1,000 fine. The Act allows them to restrict or prohibit gatherings or events and the power to close or restrict access to premises. The Act temporary closures of schools and registered childcare providers. It allows for virtual court cases via a live link. It provides for statutory sick pay to be claimed from the first day. Pensions and NHI, that will not disadvantage retirees. Residential tenancies, extending the period of notice for evictions. So most residential tenancy the eviction notice will move from 2 months to 3 months, giving them a month extra. Business tenancies, temporary restrictions, you can't enforce re-entry for non-payment of rent. So business tenants are kind of protected. It doesn't say for how long though. They've just said temporary. Food supply chains must provide information on supplies. Terms of office, councillors and mayors of local authorities will serve 3 years instead of 4 years. Not all of these rules take effect on the signing. Some will take effect when the minister switches them on. So even though I've listed out all of these, some of them are immediate, some of them will be switched on and switched off. There's certain ones that will stay on regardless. So provisions of the Act, that's what I've just said, provisions of the Act can be switched on and off as needed. Different regulations can be made for different purposes, so they can custom make regulations, probably at a whim. Powers relating to potentially infectious people, limiting gatherings and events cannot be turned on and off in this way. So that is continuous. It's going to be in effect for 2 years, extended for a period of 6 months maximum. Some provisions will not expire after 2 years, i.e. It's that emergency power, the Coronavirus Act, is supposed to run for 2 years. It could well run for 2 years and 6 months, but no more than 2 years and 6 months. But you know what? They change the laws every 5 minutes. We don't know. So Law 2, the second law. So that was the Coronavirus Act that I've just shared with you. The second law is the Health Protection Regulations 2020, which is valid for 6 months. And this is what I call the Social Distancing Act. It came into force on the 26th of March to enforce the terms of the lockdown. This law allows the police to instruct people violating social distancing regulations to go home, leave an area or disperse, and to ensure parents stop their children from breaking the rules. Under these regulations, it is an offence to violate restrictions on business movement and gathering without reasonable excuse. That word reasonable excuse again. Failure to comply with police instructions or to obstruct officials enforcing measures could result in a fine, and that is the £60 fine. Any adult 18 or over who commits an offence under the new regulations can be handed a £60 fine, reduced to 30 if payment is made within 2 weeks. If found guilty of repeated offences, the fine is doubled each time up to a maximum of £960. No one will be convicted of an offence if they pay the fine within 28 days. After 28 days, enforcement will start. Then you'll be subject to conviction. Non-payment of a fixed penalty under the coronavirus regulation results in court hearing and unlimited fines. Under the health protection regulations, children are allowed to travel between the homes of separated parents or guardians. I didn't know that. So, so if the mother lives in one place and the father lives in another place, you're justified in going to that place. But under the amendment on the 21st of April, you can't say, oh, I was taking my child to its mother or returning my child to its mother, and then you decide to go off somewhere else. You have to literally go to that place which is permitted and back. If you make some kind of detour and they find out, that is an offence. So that has been factored in, because some people, I guess they found out and they've added it in, have come out for one purpose and they've ended up doing something else. And they think that, okay, if they can say, okay, just supposing you're allowed to go out for medical supplies. You go out for medical supplies and then you think, I think I'm going to stop by so-and-so. You can't do that. You literally have to go out on the essential purpose and back, or the permitted reason and back. So no detours. They've covered every bloody element. Okay, so under the health protection regulations, I've just said that, the law also allows people to move house where reasonably necessary. Now, I didn't know, they'd stopped all the moves, so I didn't know that people could move house. So it's obviously the removers who are saying, look, we're not going to move you then. Because they're thinking, well, they're protecting their staff. But where it's reasonably necessary, the law allows you to move house, which is interesting. The Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Regulations is known as the Statutory Instrument 350, SI 350, sets out the requirement for the closure of businesses selling food or drink for consumption on the premises, except for like schools, hospitals, care homes. They can consume food on the premises. It imposes restrictions on most businesses and organisations that deal with the general public and on individual rights of movement and assembly in England. Under this law, a person commits an offence if they remain outside the place they are living without reasonable excuse, having left the place they are living for a permitted reason. That's what I was explaining before. So you're allowed to leave for a permitted reason, but if you make a little detour and they find out, you're in trouble. I think for my instincts tell me that applies to when they really, really get strict. They can apply it now, but I've got a funny feeling it's going to apply more when the second phase comes in and they really decide to take this thing seriously. At the moment, we're kind of, I'm not saying we're easing, but it's well, you know what I mean. I'm not even going to try and explain it. I'm just going to sound like a bloody, I don't know what. A reasonable excuse determined by the courts to leave or be outside your house where you live. So, yeah. Under this law, a person commits an offence if they remain outside the place they are living. Do you hear the way they word that? If they remain outside the place they are living without reasonable excuse, having left the place they are living for a permitted reason. So that is like exactly. You just go straight back. Reasonable excuses are access to all types of money services like ATM, banks, Western Union, MoneyGram, savings clubs, stuff like that. Anything to do with getting money or accessing your money. To visit a burial ground if it's open. Garden of Remembrance or ground surrounding a crematorium to pay respects to a family member or a friend. To avoid injury or illness, that applies to people who are victims of domestic abuse and need to seek a place of safety. Sickness, if you're sick and you need to get to the hospital, that's allowed. And but it's not applicable to the homeless. Of course, the homeless don't have no homes, so it doesn't apply to them. So where a child under 18 is contravening the act, the parent is responsible. However, the police can instruct a responsible adult to escort the child back home. So I think parents have to be really, really careful with that one. If your child is under 18, don't let him disobey, because they might think the person is a responsible adult and whoever's escorting your child may not be a responsible adult. So it's best to keep your child inside. Okay? Enforcement action can be taken against persons accompanying a child who is contravening the act by gathering somewhere where they should not be. So if you take your child in a place and it's not an essential activity, you're going to be done. Okay? Fixed penalty notices can be issued to a person aged 18 and over and is to be paid to the designated officer. So you know what that means? If a police officer stops you as an adult and says, look, you're not supposed to be here, you're supposed to be at home or whatever, they can demand you pay that fine on the spot. And if you don't have it, who knows? Like I said, depending on whether a policeman has a bad day, is in a bad mood, they can determine whether or not, okay, you haven't got the money, we're detaining you. Or while you're here, because you've contravened, we're going to take and test you. And goodness knows what that may result in. So make sure if you are contravening and you don't have a reasonable excuse, and remember, the reasonable excuses are the ones I have provided. If you're not out of your house for those reasons, make sure you have your £30 on you. And make sure you get a receipt. Okay. Fixed penalty notices can also be issued and collected by county councils. These regulations give legal force to social distancing rules. The place where you're living includes your garden, your private garden, your yard. I'm not quite sure what they mean by yard. In the West Indies, that's your backyard. Passage, stairways, garage and shed. And we saw that video where that family had a communal garden, and they put a paddling pool out there, and they were sitting there with their 2 kids, and the police told them it wasn't allowed. So this doesn't apply to communal gardens. It applies to private gardens. That is considered your home. If you happen to live in a flat, the only place you're allowed is in that flat itself and that part of the stairwell. I would imagine that could well lead to people chatting on the stairwells and communicating and being in touch with people that way. But there again, there is supposed to be social distancing, so they will need to be careful. So businesses that are considered essential are taxi cabs, taxis and cabs, like I've said, banks and money and places for money transfer, funeral directors, laundrettes and dry cleaners, dentists, opticians and other health-related services, hardware stores, bicycle shops. I thought that was an interesting one. Supermarkets and the pharmacy. I don't know if I've missed any off. In America, they have this document called Lockstep. It's a Rockefeller document that shares scenarios for the future of technology and international development. And it plans for a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership, with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. So the lockdown seems to be mirroring that plan. The reasons for these 2 laws is based on a family of unnaturally occurring viruses that have been manipulated or allegedly manipulated and released into the atmosphere. We are now paying the price for this error with our freedoms. People like Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci, who have apparently patents on virus solutions, seem to benefit or would benefit by a global vaccine. Gates claiming that normalcy will only return when we have vaccinated the entire global population. And what does he mean by normalcy? What is normal? What is normal? It will never be normal. So, but that is his suggestion. And the thing is that we have to ask ourselves, do they care about the global population? Or is it all about receiving the royalties on their patents for the solution of the virus, for the solution of the vaccine? And that is why people are worried. You've got people like Bill Gates talking about a global vaccine, and you kind of think, very, very interesting. In the past, we blamed ignorance, stupidity, lack of education for the demise of a generation. Who will you blame now? What is your excuse for enabling your demise, your loss of freedom, and the control of your life? I'm just asking, because we're all complicit in this, aren't we? We're just sitting around watching, and like I said, I share information. For what purpose, sometimes I wonder, because I'm not providing solutions. I don't even know what solutions to provide. I really don't know. And the thing is, you've got so many people with conflicting views and conflicting opinions. And you've got so many people telling you stuff. How do you know what is real from what isn't real? How do you know whether your lives are in danger or whether this is just fear-mongering? How do you know whether or not you have something to worry about? The only way you know is through your instincts and your guts, and by kind of validating information and seeing what makes sense to you. That's the only way you can know. You can't know just because I'm speaking on YouTube or these other people with other doctors. Everybody's a doctor now. Everybody's a professional. Everybody's an expert. And yet nobody's doing anything about it. And, that's what, yes, you have some people really passionate. Oh, this is happening, that is happening. And, that it's all manipulated. And, we're all going to be vaccinated. We're all going to end up like the millions who died from HIV and polio and all of that kind of stuff. But what are they doing? What are they telling us? What are they suggesting? Nobody's giving any answers. Nobody's giving any solutions. Nobody is telling people what to do. I can't tell anybody. I'm not an expert. I'm not an authority. I'm just a messenger. I just read stuff and I share it with you. But you've got people who are experts, who are in the know, and they're not providing answers. So how the hell can the little person on the street or someone like me provide answers or give you solutions? I can't. It's beyond my remit. I'd love to, because sometimes I get so disheartened. I get disheartened when I'm reading stuff and I know the outcome or the possible outcome, and there's nothing I can do. I feel quite helpless, to be honest. So it's each individual's responsibility to do what's best for them. That's all I'm saying. And that's all for now. Bye-bye.